I'm Chance Dorland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from ExpressNews.com with in-depth reporting and other resources for stories affecting San Antonio and Bexar County. San Antonio Express News criminal justice reporter Emilie Eaton joins us again to delve into an incident from the past that has come back into the headlines after the release of police body cam footage that some say shows excessive force, while at the same time is used by others to back up the actions of the two San Antonio police officers involved. So, Emilie, great to have you back here on the program. 2 weeks in a row, two very important stories. Let's start with this one for today's episode. This debate stems from a day back in February of 2017, when then 18-year-old David Ramirez was listening to music on headphones while walking in the middle of a residential street near the southwest side. So tell me about that day and how police came to be involved.
Well, thank you again for having me back on the show. So as you said, it was February 19th, 2017, and Officers Arnaldo Sanchez and Officer Raymond De Leon were in the area for a disturbance involving a homeless man at a nearby Walgreens. And so they just happened to turn onto this road where David Ramirez was walking in the middle of the street.
Hey, come here. Hey! Hey! I'm talking to you. Sorry, come
sir.
here. Get over there.
Sorry, sir. Can you...
Hey, chill, guy.
Can you let me go, please?
No. Chill.
Please?
Turn around. Put your hands behind your back. Just put your hands behind your back. Just put your hands behind your back.
Please, let go. I'll put my hands behind my back. Can you please let me go? Let me go.
Relax, dude. Relax.
What are you...
Hey.
David later told police officers that he was walking in the middle of the street because he was trying to get away from a dog that was nearby, presumably a sort of aggressive dog. And he was walking in the middle of the street when the officers honked at him and he started moving towards the sidewalk. He continued, he had his headphones in still, and he didn't really stop to acknowledge the police officers. And that's when Officer Sanchez got out of his car and approached David Ramirez and basically said, "Hey, you, I'm talking to you." And Ramirez pulled out his headphones and he said, "I'm sorry, sir." And Officer Sanchez grabbed him by the arm and tried to bring him back to his police vehicle. And that's when David started to give a little bit of resistance, according to the body camera footage. He sort of started pulling away and saying, "I'm sorry, sir. I'm sorry. Did I do something wrong?" And Officer Sanchez said, "No, just chill. Just come to the car back with me," or something to that effect. And David continued to resist, and eventually Officer Sanchez and Officer De Leon took him to the ground and were trying to bring his arms behind his back and handcuff him.
You're choking. I can't
Turn around. Turn around.
I'm trying.
Turn around.
You can't,
Turn
but
around.
I can't.
Turn around.
I can't. Y'all won't let me. What the fuck, man?
Fucking turn over, dude.
Don't let me. Let go so I can. Get off me, man, please. I'm not doing nothing.
Turn it over,
I'm
man.
trying.
Throughout this whole ordeal, David was putting up a little bit of a fight. I mean, he wasn't actually like throwing punches or anything of that sort.
Ah! Somebody help me, man.
Turn around.
Okay.
What are you reaching for?
I'm not reaching for nothing. I'm
You
trying
are.
to get up.
Turn around.
I'm trying to get up.
Turn around.
Can I call my dad, please?
No.
I'm trying to call my dad. Please. Let me go.
After he was finally handcuffed, it was probably about 5 minutes total. Officer Sanchez lifted him up and slammed him against the hood of his patrol car. And that's that's what got the attention of Police Chief William McManus, which we'll go into later.
Yeah, lots more questions that we can get to about this specific incident. And I just want to mention that throughout today's episode, we're going to be hearing short clips of audio from that video. They're not played in their entirety. There is editing done to get to parts of it that we want you to hear. So all of that video is available at expressnews.com. The link to this story is in the description of today's episode if you'd like to check more of that video out than what you're hearing today. So we're going to get to Chief William McManus here in a second, Emilie. I want to talk about that body cam that I just mentioned. How did the San Antonio Express News get their hands on that? Because that really has reignited debate about this incident incident, which once again took place in 2017?
That's a good question. We actually requested that video back in 2017 after we first learned about this incident. I was curious about the video because I request suspensions every month for police officers at the San Antonio Police Department. And very rarely are police officers ever suspended or reprimanded for use of force. And Officer Sanchez was in this case. And so I was sort of curious what exactly he had done, and I wanted to see the video for myself. I requested it back in 2017, and I actually didn't get it until recently. Sometimes it takes a long time to go through the open records process.
So we'll talk more about the suspension here in a moment. But to get back to David Ramirez, the 18-year-old, at least at the time of that video, he was eventually arrested, but not for the initial thing that brought him to the attention of the police, walking in the street. What did police charge him with, and why were they able to do that?
So after police officers apprehended and arrested him, they found him with a small amount of marijuana, and they charged him with possession of marijuana less than 2 ounces. They also attempted to charge him with resisting arrest, but that charge, it appears, did not stick because it is not in the Bexar County records. So likely what happened is a magistrate judge dismissed that charge before it ever was formally filed.
And then that marijuana charge itself was dismissed at some point, correct?
Yes, he was not charged with possession of marijuana. That charge got dismissed later in the year.
And so now to circle back to Chief William McManus of the San Antonio Police Department, as you already mentioned, Emilie, he later, after the fact, concluded that one of the 2 officers, Arnaldo Sanchez, used excessive force, which, as you just mentioned, that's a conclusion that happens rarely with that department. So how would you describe the culture of SAPD when it comes to accusations and then perhaps arriving at the fact that, yes, an officer did use excessive force?
That's a really good question, and it actually is a tough one to answer. I would say that this culture does not exist just in the San Antonio Police Department. It exists in police departments nationwide. I think police departments and administrators are very weary of charging officers either in criminal court or just administratively with excessive force. Officers get a lot of discretion to use force, and very rarely do people bring that into, police advocates for reform often bring that up, but administrators typically will not reprimand police officers for excessive force. So, for example, last year, there were roughly 80 suspensions at the San Antonio Police Department, and only 3 of them, including Sanchez's, were for excessive force.
And Emilie, that being the case, it's actually true that this was not the first time that 4-year SAPD officer Arnaldo Sanchez has been in the public eye. A few years back in 2015, Sanchez and another officer responded to a call about a family disturbance. There's more details there, but basically he and the other officer ended up using tasers a total of 9 times on a 33-year-old who became unresponsive and was pronounced dead at the scene. So tell me a little bit about that incident, and also there's ongoing legal proceedings surrounding that.
Correct. So as you said, Officer Sanchez and another officer were dispatched to Norman Cooper's home. Norman Cooper was 33, and he was at his parents' home. They were not home at the time. They were on vacation, I believe, and his brother was there. His brother let him into the home. And Norman was acting really erratic and was quoting Bible verses and doing really odd things. So his brother called police, and that's when Officer Sanchez and another officer showed up. At one point, they tried to sort of bring Norman outside, and he becomes uncooperative. And they said they sort of feared for themselves, not necessarily for their lives, but that he was becoming erratic and hard to control. So they ended up using their taser on him. Between the 2 of them, they deployed the taser 9 times in 3 minutes, and he was later pronounced dead at the scene. He was 33 years old. Shortly after that incident, the police department found that Sanchez was justified in using force, and they did give him a written reprimand, but he was not formally disciplined. And in 2016, Norman Cooper's family filed a lawsuit in federal civil court, for excessive use of force. So that lawsuit is still ongoing. At one point, the lawsuit was originally filed against the two officers, but also the San Antonio Police Department and the acting chief at the time, Anthony Trevino. Those individuals were later dismissed from the lawsuit. So the city and Anthony Trevino are no longer defendants in the lawsuit as it stands now. But the Officer Sanchez and the other officers still face this lawsuit. It's really slow going.
So Officer Sanchez is involved in that lawsuit. We also have this incident from 2017, no lawsuit at this time, but there is the suspension of the officer. So let's talk about that. This was specifically for violating the department's treatment of prisoners, procedures, and using, quote, unnecessary physical force when slamming the 18-year-old at the time, Ramirez, onto the hood of the car while he was handcuffed. But Sanchez was not disciplined for other actions during that altercation, just what I just mentioned. He agreed to the suspension and waived any right to an appeal, but the disciplinary action was held in abeyance for a year. That means it was eligible to be wiped from his record if he didn't break any similar rules. He didn't do that, and it was removed from his record. So that type of situation, you've already mentioned, Emilie, how excessive force findings against officers in the San Antonio Police Department, and you also talked about nationally, perhaps not so common. But this situation, when even there is some sort of reprimand, in this case a suspension, it's been wiped from his record. Is that type of thing common when it comes to discipline for SAPD officers?
Yes, it is. I've seen several suspensions in the 2 years that I've worked at the San Antonio Express News, and I've been requesting suspension records. I've seen several officers who were suspended, but later got the suspension wiped off their record because they weren't ever accused of any similar wrongdoing. The way this all sort of comes about, when an officer is investigated within the department, within the Internal Affairs Department, after Internal Affairs makes its determination as to whether something happened or not, the case is brought to a citizens review board. And the review board consists of the same amount, I forgot the number, but the same amount of police officers and the same amount of citizens. And they look at all of the evidence and they say, okay, for example, in this case, did this guy use excessive force? And if so, should he be suspended? And they make their recommendations to the chief. The chief makes the final call. And in this case, he said that he was going to issue Officer Sanchez a 2-day suspension. But the officer also has a chance to meet with Chief McManus and to dispute the charges against him or the allegations against him. And in this case, Chief McManus, it appears, listened to him and decided, okay, I'll give you a 2-day suspension, but it'll be held in abeyance of a year, which means if you don't mess up again in the next year, then it will no longer be on your record.
Another aspect of this that I want to talk about, which is very well detailed in your write-up. Once again, the link is in today's description at expressnews.com. The president of the San Antonio Police Officers Association disagrees with Chief McManus. That choice of his to issue Sanchez a 2-day suspension, even though there was an abeyance. And the president of the San Antonio Police Officers Association says that both of those things could inadvertently discourage an officer from approaching someone on the street, the way that happened in the video that once again is available with your story online, and we've been hearing snippets of during today's episode. This is also something that others who watched the video, including 2 professors with expertise in officers' use of force, have mentioned as things that came up as they watched that video themselves. So this is kind of the other side of the argument. One side saying excessive force, the other side saying, well, maybe there was, maybe there wasn't, but reprimanding an officer for this might have unintended consequences down the road. Could you tell me what you heard from some of these experts? What were some of the things they said after viewing that video?
Yeah. So Mr. Helly, who is the San Antonio Police Officer Association president, he specifically took issue with the suspension because he felt like an officer who was dispatched to a normal call, like something like this, would be weary of actually doing his job. He fears that an officer might just stay back or put himself in risk because he doesn't want to mess up again. He doesn't want the situation to escalate as it did with this incident. Some other use of force experts who I contacted, one of them who is a former New York Police Department police officer, said that he felt like Officer Sanchez's initial approach might have been a little aggressive, but he said it was understandable given the fact that David Ramirez was walking in the middle of the street. He was acting, in this professor's eyes, a little erratically by walking in the middle of the street. He said police officers always have to be on edge and have to be prepared for any type of situation. So when an officer is approaching someone, they don't know what's going through this kid's head, if he has any intentions of doing anything else, if he's doing anything else erratic. And as a result, the police officer might take a more aggressive approach in, grabbing David and dragging him to the car or pulling him to the car. These professors also said that there is a reason to bring suspects closer to your car. It acts as a leverage point for a police officer. It's something that a lot of police officers are taught in training academy because it acts as a place where you can push someone up against your car instead of ending up on the ground like they did in this case, which is obviously not preferable for anyone involved. The car also is where they have their computer system and where they can look up warrants. So there's like a sense of protection and a sense of home base with being near the police car. And so that can sort of explain why Officer Sanchez was so pushy from the start and like saying, hey, come on, let's go over to my car so we can talk.
And then finally, Emilie, we're running out of time for today's episode, but I want to give you a chance for final thoughts and then also perhaps a mention of anything else regarding this incident moving into the future. Where might this go moving into the next weeks and months? Is there anything left with this story?
I'm not sure. We haven't been able to get a hold of David Ramirez, and I think he would be the person who could bring this into the light more. I mean, he could be the person who could potentially sue the department or sue the officers, but he hasn't been very vocal. In fact, he never actually complained to the police department. The police department saw this footage themselves, and they are the ones who initiated the investigation and initiated the suspension. So it sort of appears like we might not hear a lot from David Ramirez, and that this incident might sort of just fade into the background. We certainly will be hearing a lot more about that previous incident that I talked about, in which Norman Cooper was tased and later died as a result of his injuries. So that certainly will be coming up, and I'm sure that the lawyer in that case will be keeping an eye on this footage and saying, okay, does this officer have a propensity of violence or of being too aggressive in his policing approach? So only time will tell.
And thank you to San Antonio Express News criminal justice reporter Emilie Eaton for joining me 2 weeks in a row here on the In-Depth Podcast, an interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorlin.